Coming to you live from the AM 950 studios, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, also WCPT 820 Chicago's Progressive Talk, and 1150 AM KKNW in Seattle. This is the Matt McNeil Show. Matt is gone on vacation for a couple more days. I'm Bruce Klopfleisch, sitting in for Matt. I have one of the weekend shows called Politics Matters, How Civics, Law, and Politics Affect You, Saturdays at 7 and Sundays at 5. So I'm doing today's show and tomorrow's show. If you have a question, you can call 952-946-6205. Or if you have an email, you can send it to comment@am950radio.com. So at the beginning of the show today, we're going to get right into an interview. So we're going to jump into that. So we have Ian Millhiser, who is a senior correspondent at Vox. And he's going to talk to us about some of the redistricting efforts that are going around, especially the one in Virginia. Ian, thanks for coming on today's show.
Good to be here. Thanks so much.
All right, so I have read a couple of the articles that you have written, and at least as it goes right to what the state of Virginia tried to do with redistricting and how ultimately it didn't work. So could you give us a little bit of a background on what Virginia was trying to do initially, at least here?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really understand what happened in Virginia or in several other states unless you understand the broad national fight that's going on.
Right.
So sometime last year, Donald Trump announced that he wanted as many red states as possible to engage in maximal gerrymandering to try to rig the House of Representatives election for the Republican Party. Texas enacted its map. California then enacted a retaliatory map, and then there's several others been a bit more tit for tat. And part of that tit for tat was Virginia enacted a map that was supposed to give Democrats 4 additional seats. And the way that the Virginia Constitution works, in order to put those maps in place, there had to be a referendum. It was submitted to the voters. The voters passed it. And then after the voters had voted, yes, we want these new maps, the state Supreme Court, on a legal theory that I find very unpersuasive.
Yeah, you're not alone on that. Yeah, you're not alone on that. Yeah.
Yeah, decided that it was going to overturn the thing that the voters had literally just voted for.
Yeah. And now you can correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there a previous lawsuit filed that it went up to the Virginia Supreme Court and they had a chance if they wanted to stop their referendum in the first place, but they let it go, right? Am I right there?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think there are several errors in the Virginia Supreme Court's decision, but I think the single worst thing that they did is if they were going to stop this thing, they should have stopped it before the vote happened.
Right. Because
when you're a government official, I don't care if you're the President of the United States, I don't care if you're a judge, I don't care if you're just like an ordinary police officer, if you're anyone who works for the government, everything that you do in a democracy is supposed to be a proxy for what the voters want. And, it's not practical to call a referendum every time any government official has to make any decision. And, there are good reasons why you don't want to do it. You don't want to make it easy to call a referendum because, sometimes passions do take people over. But the whole point of a democracy is that every government official works for the electorate. And if you do poll the electorate and the electorate says, X, then I don't know if it's ever appropriate for a judge to step in and say not X. The judge's job, if they thought that this referendum shouldn't have been triggered for whatever reason, they should have stopped it before the referendum happened.
And they didn't in this case, and the vote went on. And
they did. Yeah, and I mean the argument they used for why they decided to overturn the referendum, I thought was very, very weak. They made two arguments. I mean, one was this extremely technical argument about the meaning of the word election that isn't going to persuade anyone. And unfortunately, the dissenting opinion then also tried to get in a fight about the meaning of the word election, and their opinion wasn't persuasive either. I mean, this was not the sort of case that turns on dictionaries. What the better argument that the state Supreme Court made was they said that, so the way the Virginia Constitution works is that if you want to have a constitutional amendment, it took a constitutional amendment to do this, the legislature has to vote to amend the Constitution, then there has to be another election, then there has to be another vote in the legislature to call a referendum, and then the voters get to vote in the referendum whether or not they approve of the amendment or not. Mm-hmm. And the first vote happened after early voting had already begun in the state of Virginia. And the state Supreme Court said, well, wait, all these people who had already cast their early votes, they were disenfranchised because they never got to vote. They didn't get to vote in the election knowing whether the person they were voting for had supported the amendment or not. And there's a big, big problem with that argument, which is that the voters of Virginia were not disenfranchised because there was a referendum and we got to vote for it. It would be one thing, if there was a different process, if like the two legislative votes alone were enough to pass it, then that might be a pretty good argument. But you can't claim that the voters were disenfranchised when there was a referendum.
Yeah, that was, when I first heard this case come out, I'm like, and it was like, what? I mean, they actually had a vote. The people voted for it, ultimately, and it was a fairly close decision, I guess. But when they voted for it, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, this election is canceled by four Republican judges on the Virginia Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's a very shocking, and it was shocking. I mean, if I seem angry, it's because I am also a Virginia voter. I live in the state.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I voted in that referendum, and those justices work for me. I mean, they don't work for me exclusively, but they work for the people of the state of Virginia.
Yeah.
And the people of the state of Virginia were asked what our opinion was on this, and we gave it. And you don't get to override that when you're a government official.
Yeah. Now they just disenfranchised all your votes that they just canceled. I mean, when I heard that, and I teach at a community college for political science. And some of my students were saying the same things, like, how do they get to cancel an election? How does that happen here? But, I guess it happens in Virginia. So one of the key things involved in this case is, this is a state constitution. Right. And they have the process that it's level, laid out for what they're supposed to do here. And that's why it was in the state court initially. But then it's gone to federal court, hasn't it? I mean, isn't that what they did?
It briefly went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I got to tell you, as mad as I am about what the Virginia State Supreme Court did, I am happy that the U.S. Supreme Court did not get involved. So
me too.
So the Virginia AG, who's a Democrat, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and his main argument was that, so there's this cockamamie legal doctrine that the Supreme Court keeps rejecting over and over again. Let me take a step back. The way that things normally work is that if there's a federal law question, so if there's a question about what the U.S. Constitution says, what an act of Congress says, that the Supreme Court of the United States has the final word on what that law means, and if you don't like what the U.S. Supreme Court says, the only thing you can do is change the law. When there's a question of state law or a state constitution, the state Supreme Court has the final word on it, and the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to play no role whatsoever. There have been several lawsuits recently. Up until this one, they had all been brought by Republicans that were trying to change that rule and try to make it so that the Supreme Court of the United States would also have the final word on matters of state election law, at least when they concern federal elections. And, I mean, I am not happy with what my state Supreme Court did, but the nice thing about state Supreme Courts is Some of them are controlled by Democrats. Some of them are controlled by Republicans. Some of them are even controlled by, like, technocratic, nonpartisan judges, like we're supposed to have. But, like, you don't have, depending on what state you're in, you could have a different kind of court.
Yeah.
The U.S. Supreme Court has 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And as we've seen from its recent Voting Rights Act decisions and its other gerrymandering decisions, it's pretty eager to do what the Republican Party wants it to do. So,
right.
Between living in a world where every single election dispute is resolved in the Republican Party's favor, or living in a world where sometimes they'll be considered by Republican courts, sometimes they'll be considered by a Democratic court, sometimes they may even be considered by a neutral court, depending on what state you're in, I would rather live in that second world. Like, I don't want every single contested election to be decided by Brett Kavanaugh.
Right. Or John Roberts or Clarence Thomas or any of those 6
right.
Republicans up there right now.
Right.
Yeah. For once or maybe even twice, I actually agreed with the Supreme Court decision in this one. It's like, they don't have jurisdiction, and like you said, I don't want them deciding, who wins elections and who doesn't. So, I guess and they didn't even spend that much time, considering it. They just said, well, no, this is a state issue basically, and they're decided not to get involved in it. So
it was like a 1-sentence order.
Yeah.
It was issued like a day or 2 after the briefing was finished. And I mean, I will give the U.S. Supreme Court credit here. They did the right thing by doing nothing.
That which is hard for them to do, doing the right thing.
It is. They are not good at doing nothing. I wish they did nothing more often.
Right. So we're coming up on our break here pretty soon, but we got more to talk about here, but before we probably have like 35 seconds or so before the break. But could you at least give us a little bit of an idea of what the reaction in Virginia has been to this decision since you live there?
I mean, it's been more or less what you'd expect it to be. I mean, the state, Democrats control the governor's mansion and both houses of the state legislature. They're all mad. The Democrats control the AG. The AG's mad. Yeah. I think a lot of voters are mad because, again, they voted for this thing. There is a good chance that it's going to come up again.
All right. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back from the break. That's all right. All right, welcome back to the Matt McNeil Show. I'm Bruce Klopfleisch, sitting in for Matt today and tomorrow, and then he's back from his vacation. So if you have a question, you can call 952-946-6205 or send an email to comment@am950radio.com. My show is Politics Matters. I'm one of the weekend hosts. You can check out my show Saturdays at 7 o'clock and Sundays at 5 o'clock. So I'm talking with Ian Millhiser, one of the senior correspondents at Vox, and we're talking about redistricting maps and some of the things that have been going on lately, particularly the one in Virginia. So just before the break, we were talking about how what the reaction has been to the state Supreme Court in Virginia basically canceling an election. So Ian, what has been the response of like the Democratic leaders in Virginia?
Yeah. Well, so I think what we're going to see, what we are going to see happen in Virginia is the same thing that we've seen happen both at the federal level with the U.S. Supreme Court and in many state courts, which is that, despite this one very bad decision that the Virginia Supreme Court just handed down, our state Supreme Court has a reputation for being one of the more technocratic and nonpartisan state Supreme Courts out there. It has not been as politicized as many other courts at that level. But now that it handed down this decision, which isn't just wrong, it made a lot of Democrats mad. Well, Democrats control the state legislature, and in Virginia, the legislature appoints the judges and the justices. And there will be 2 seats coming open within the next year.
Okay.
Within the next year or 2. And so I think we can expect that those seats are going to be filled by someone pretty hackish because Democrats aren't going to want to roll the dice on something like this happening again. And so you're going to get kind of a left Alito-like figure who, is a more reliable Democratic partisan. And that's what we've seen at the U.S. Supreme Court, where now every justice is vetted within an inch of their life to make sure they'll never do anything that'll disappoint their political party. That's what you've seen in a lot of state Supreme Court races. I covered the Wisconsin Supreme Court for many years, and every year or two, there's this drag down partisan election to see who gets to control the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the stakes there are huge. I mean, in 2020, the Wisconsin Supreme Court came within one vote of trying to throw out Joe Biden's victory in that state.
Right.
So, so what has happened is that the courts, which, we want judges who are going to be technocrats and are going to apply the law as fairly as they can, and in ways that, try to honor what that law was seeking to accomplish and not just achieve someone's partisan goals. That's what we want. But I don't think that's what we're going to have in any state. I mean, I think that, my state Supreme Court is going to become dominated by Democratic hacks because of this decision. You have other states and you have the federal courts, which are dominated by Republican hacks. And that's not good for anyone. Mm-hmm. I want to live in a world where judges act in good faith and without, partisan motives. And I don't know how we get back to a world that's like that after this.
Yeah. And I think it's just going to get worse, as time goes on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's going to keep getting worse. I mean, there's things that you could do, if it were possible to amend the U.S. Constitution. You could change the way we pick federal judges. There are some states that pick their state judges in ways. There's the Missouri system, for example. Missouri and several other states have a process where they have a nonpartisan. Well, they have a commission, and some seats of the commission, the commissioners are chosen by the state bar. Some seats are chosen by the state governor. I think in some states they're chosen by the chief justice. In some states, the chief justice actually sits on the court, or sits on the commission, and then that commission plays the biggest role in picking the judges. And the idea behind that system is, sometimes these commissions are captured by one party or the other, and you wind up getting partisan judges. But it's much harder to capture one of these commissions where you have multiple different inputs to it. Where you have to get the bar and the governor and the chief justice and maybe some other people who are appointing folks to all march in the same direction in order to capture the commission. So you could do something like that. I think you'd wind up with better judges. The British use a system like that. You could do something like what the French do. So in France, if you want to be a judge, you actually go to judge school, and it's a different degree than the legal degree you get so you can be an advocate. And then once you become a judge, it's a civil service position, and judges, the more senior judges decide who to promote, and the idea is to get people who are going to be more technocratic and less political and going to think like civil servants in that role. So there are other ways that you can pick judges in the way that we do it. But so long as you have the system we have, at the federal level, they're nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, so that they're nominated by a partisan official and they're confirmed by a partisan body. And so long as that's your method of picking judges, you're going to wind up with a lot of political hacks.
Yeah, here in Minnesota, we elect all of our state judges, but the governor, for the most part, nominates them, or you can challenge someone in an election. But still, even when there's, the elections for judges have turned into, pretty partisan as well.
Right.
Go
ahead.
Do you think we have a couple minutes left here? Do you think that Virginia is going to try to do this again? To change their maps?
Yeah, I mean, the state's already talking about doing it again, and it's not just Virginia because bear in mind we just had this Clay decision that came down from the Supreme Court that repealed most of what remained of the Voting Rights Act, which means that a lot of southern red states that previously were required to have a minimum number of majority black congressional districts now don't. And so, you're seeing in state after state, the Republican Party is redrawing the maps to make them whiter and more Republican. And Democrats, they're aware that that threat is going on. And it's not just Virginia where I'm hearing people talking about new maps in New York, people talk about new maps in Illinois, people talk about new maps in Colorado. Like there's a lot of blue states where we could potentially see Democrats fighting their side of the gerrymandering war. And I mean, I hate it. I hate it for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I hate it because often when you draw districts, there's other reasons other than partisanship why you want to draw things a certain way. Like there might be a town in northern Minnesota where everyone there has a common interest. You want them all to share the same member of Congress so that interest can be represented. It's often beneficial for a state to have both Democratic and Republican representatives, because when there's a Republican in the White House, you want there to be a Republican member of Congress who can advocate on behalf of the state's interests, because that president probably isn't going to listen to a Democrat.
Yeah.
And so, this is, the Supreme Court created this mess by eliminating all the federal protections we have against gerrymandering. And now we're just going to live in a world where every state map is maximally gerrymandered.
Well, thank you, Ian Millhiser, senior correspondent at Vox, for coming onto the show today and explaining this for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep on loving.